Welcome everyone this evening to our webinar, Fit to Run, Strength and Mobility for Runners. So this evening, we're going to talk about how strength and mobility can benefit you as a runner. So let me first introduce myself. My name is Miriam Mulkewich. I'm a registered physiotherapist at Fit for Life Physiotherapy. I've been practicing physiotherapy now I'm going into my 28th year, which is hard to believe, and been running for longer. And I because I love running so much, I really do think it's important to keep people running and, continue on in their sport of choice. So let's get going. And I wanted to just do a quick recap on some of the things that we talked about last week. I won't spend a lot of time on this because there's lots that we can talk about strength and mobility. So certainly what we've found in the research is that it's really difficult to identify specific things that can explain injury, and that it really is sort of a multifactorial problem. So there could be issues related to our training response or how quickly we load our bodies, that sort of idea of doing too much, too fast, too soon. Social aspects like stress it has definitely been shown to have an impact on injury. Stress, perhaps in the sense that when we're under stress, if that's something that you do as a runner to relieve stress, you might be doing more running, which leads to, again, that too much, too fast, too soon. Stress also has an impact on how we recover and how our body maintains our capacity to manage the load. Sleep also has an impact on our ability to recover, and again, our ability to manage load, that kind of thing. It's interesting that there are some psychological factors that have definitely shown to have an impact on our risk of injury. So they've shown in young athletes that perfectionism is something that can lead to injury in running. And I think that's, again, it's related to that doing too much and pushing too hard. And those are common sort of personality aspects of a runner that, runners tend to want to really push the limits. So it's not just one thing. It's not just the running shoes. It's not just the gait pattern or stretching or whatnot. There's a lot of different things to consider. And, really what I see in practice, as well as what, we garner from the research, is that it really is important to balance the training load on our body and our body's ability to manage that load. And some things to consider about our own capacity to manage load is certainly our current and previous running history, our overall activity and fitness level, strength, mobility, functional movement patterns, how our body can absorb those loads that we place on it. And running does place a lot of load on our bodies. It's 2.5 times our body weight, and we're doing that every single stride, one on one leg, right? So it is a significant amount of load and force through our bodies. And certainly current and previous injury has an impact on our ability to manage that load, as does age. Certainly as we get older, we do lose strength. Now, that doesn't mean we can't gain strength and we can't maintain strength, but without doing sort of appropriate strengthening, that does happen. And so our capacity to manage loads, if we're continuing to progress our running and so on. So these are all things to think about and sort of evaluate for ourselves, where are we at and what's our risk level, so to speak, of maybe going beyond what our capacity is. The other thing that's actually not listed there is other health conditions, or particularly medications, and certain medications might have an impact on the strength of our connective tissue. So really, it's a finding balance to reduce that injury risk. So, when we're really balanced our training, where we have, a mix of low level training to moderate and high intensity, so that 80% should be low level, 20% high intensity. that we do some strengthening and mobility work that allows our bodies to, maintain our capacity to manage the load placed on us by running. We need to allow enough recovery. And I think this is what I find often happens with runners. And on the other side, you'll see a focus on high intensity exercise, no regular recovery, too many races or competitions, that we don't give our body enough time to recover, to regenerate, in order for us to manage the loads that are placed on us when we're running. So these are all things that we want to keep in mind. And so today we're going to talk more about mobility and strengthening and some practical things to think about, and what's important to take away and what's important to focus on. So I chose the word mobility for runners instead of saying stretching for runners, because I don't think it's necessarily just about stretching. It's about mobility of our joints and the ability of our bodies to move well in a functional movement pattern, and allowing us to do what we need to do to achieve a good running gait, or to achieve good form in our strengthening exercises that we do. So we're going to talk just briefly about, is stretching important for runners? Is a warm-up needed for runners? What should be included in a warm-up? What areas in the body are important to stretch or move? So stretching versus warm-up. And some people, I think, sort of use the two words interchangeably. And stretching isn't necessarily what I would suggest we use as a warm-up for a runner just prior to a run. I think stretching is important, but not necessarily as a warm-up. There is no consistent evidence out there in the research that says that stretching prevents injury with running, exercise, sport. What is shown is that a dynamic warm-up, something that involves just movement of our joints and increases blood flow to the area, that is more effective in preparing our body for running, sport, exercise, what it might be. There is some things that are showing in the evidence, which is why we don't necessarily want to stretch right before, is that when we do a prolonged static stretch, those muscle fibers are really lengthened. And when those muscle fibers are lengthened, they kind of try to grab onto each other. And if they're so stretched out, it's going to be hard for them to latch onto each other. And we actually do see a decrease in strength for a few hours after a prolonged static stretch. So it isn't something that is ideal to do before a sport that requires some power and strength. I do think it's important at times to do some stretching separate from that when we have areas that are tight or limited and are impacting our ability to move well in our sport of choice, and in this case, in running. So let's first just talk about dynamic warm-up ideas. So things, and I think this is where it depends a little bit on what's your workout going to be, right? Is it just going for a run? You may find that just doing a little bit of a walk before you start, a very slow jog that's much slower than what your pace intends to be, is enough to get you moving. If you're planning to do something that's a little bit more intense, whether it's strides or whether it's some interval training or hills or something that's going to require a little more force from your body, we might want to warm it up a little bit more with some things like high knees, butt kicks, walking lunges, side lunges. Karaoke which is that sort of sidestepping kind of motion. It gets us moving in a different way. And that just starts to, bring blood flow to the air, loosen up the areas, but also warm up the joints. And I do think that that's also an important thing to do if you're going for a run immediately after, say, a long day of work, sitting at your desk, right? If you've been sitting for a long time in a flexed position and then you're feeling a little stiff, when you run, you do really need to extend through the joints. And, we want that mobility to do that. We want to feel a little bit warmed up. So I have a video here of this runner, Noah, this is his dynamic warm-up before a workout. And so this was part of a workout that included actually a short run, a very, very easy jog before he did this dynamic warm-up session that then was preceded some strides and some speed work. So the high knees really gets you moving your hip joints through flexion starts to get you pumping your arms, bringing blood flow to the area, even a little bit of some trunk movement. Let me see if I can move this on a little further here. Oh, I didn't mean to change our slides quite yet. Sorry about this. I slid along the wrong one here. Oh my goodness. Sorry. Technical difficulties. Let's get back to here. So I may just kind of talk through this and we'll get through it a little quicker. So there's high knees here. He does a little bit of some butt kicks where you're kicking your buttocks. So you're really kind of warming up the hamstrings. There's a little bit of what we call A's and B's where, you know, you're bringing the knee up, you're lengthening out the leg. And I'm afraid to try to straighten this, move this along a little faster in case I just have to start all over again. So these kinds of things, again, as I said, if you've been sitting for a long time, I think these can be a really great way to just get the body moving a little bit. And if you're about to do a more strenuous workout that involves, you know, a little bit more speed work, that definitely would be important to include in. I'm just going to see if he's going on to the next. Oh, there we go. So this is where we're getting a little bit of some even length through the hamstrings a little bit. So you might kind of do a little bit on one side, and then you would do a little bit leading with the other side. So again, it gets us, you know, with some range of motion and some activity in the muscle. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but you do get a little bit of the idea of something more dynamic that gives us some movement, range of motion, but it's not a prolonged static stretch. And so is stretching important for runners? Well, I think that depends, right? It depends on whether there are areas of your body that have limited mobility that might impact sort of effective and efficient functional movement. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those areas of that might be needed to be targeted. And the other reason to do stretching is if it feels good. Again, as we said, there's no evidence that suggests that doing stretching before and after a run or exercise really does anything to prevent injury. But I know a lot of people that just feel better when they do a little bit of stretching after. I do hesitate to do any real kind of big stretching immediately after a really hard workout or a really hard run, because I think our tissues are potentially a little bit more sensitive and vulnerable. So that's where a cool down is definitely important. You don't want to just stop your workout and, you know, then just kind of go and sit down. You want to move, you know, and move the joints, go through. You might even do a little bit of something similar to that dynamic warm up. But if you just are sort of stopping and then kind of getting into a really big static stretch, you know, that might be a little bit much for the muscles. So it's something that I think can be done later. Do a cool down and certainly keep your body moving at a much easier intensity. So, you know, what stretching is, it really depends on the person and their body and how it's moving. So some of the areas that are important for mobility for runs. So if we look at ankle mobility, we'll sort of start our way at the bottom and work our way up. Dorsiflexion is that action of pulling your toes back towards you. And that movement is really important as we're running, right? As every time you take a stride, you're lifting your toes up so that your heel can strike the ground. And if there is limitation in that movement, it is going to be impacted further up the line. The reason that ankle mobility is important is if we're doing some strengthening and say we're doing squats, if our ankle mobility is limited, it is going to limit how well we're able to do that squat and potentially put a little bit more load on our knees. So that's an area that we want to really make sure that we have some good mobility. Hip mobility is important. I think all movements are important, but particularly extension. As we run and as we stride, we need that extension behind us. And if we're missing that extension, first of all, we're not getting the range of motion and the power that we might get from those glutes and the hamstrings that extend our hip. But we also may find that over time, as we run, that we might get a little bit of soreness in our back, because if our hips are not extending well, our body's going to figure out how to kind of do the movement, and it's going to move other places. And that's where, I don't know if you've ever sort of felt after a long run that you have a little bit of some tightness in your lower back. And that may be related not necessarily just to lower back tightness, but to our hip extension mobility. And it's certainly, yes, our lower back mobility is important, that if we don't have that ability to extend through our lower back, we may run into problems, particularly as we get into a longer run. Thoracic spine mobility, I think, is something that is not really thought about a lot. And I do think this is something that's really important, our ability to extend or bend backwards. So particularly when we're doing a squat, for example, and again, hopefully we're including that as part of our strengthening program. If we don't have great thoracic spine mobility and we're still kind of rounded forward, it changes how we're able to do that squat and impacts, again, potentially the load on our knees, hips, and so on. The other thing, the other reason I think thoracic spine mobility is important, and the thoracic spine is the part of the spine, the middle, that you've got your neck, then you've got that mid back, and our lower back. And the thoracic spine is where those ribs attach. And when we have limited thoracic spine mobility, that has an impact on how well our ribs move. And when we breathe, because our diaphragm lives underneath our rib cage, we want our rib cage to be able to expand out. Okay. If we lose that mobility, the breath doesn't have anywhere to go but up. And that's where we start to get a lot of tension through our neck. And it is something that I've also seen with runners that, that have that limited mobility, when they get into longer runs, or they're getting into, faster runs where potentially, as you're running faster, you are moving your arms and you need that mobility through your trunk. If you've lost that mobility, you're going to feel it other places. You may feel it in your lower back. You might feel it in the neck and shoulders. So these are some of the areas that I think are important for runners. And again, everybody is going to be a little bit different. Somebody might need some work in all of these areas. Somebody might need some work in just some. I wanted to just kind of quickly touch base on anatomy so you had a little bit of a frame of reference. So this picture here on the left, you'll see this muscle here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is your hip flexor muscle, and it starts right at the front of your lumbar spine and comes down to the front of your hips here. So really close relationship to our lumbar spine. So as you can see, if this is limited and we're not getting the movement we want here, we're going to see that happen through the lower back. And here you can see the rib cage, and underneath here, the rib cage here is where our diaphragm lives. And you can see there's a really close connection here with where the hip flexor muscle attaches, as well as where the diaphragm attaches. So there's definitely some fascial connections there. On this picture on the right-hand side, so the big gluteus maximus muscle has been taken off. So you can see here the gluteus medius muscle here, your piriformis, and some of these small little internal rotators of the hip. And then this muscle is the one that I wanted to kind of really point out here, as well as the hamstrings. So there's a group of 3 muscles that actually make up the hamstrings. They start right at the sit bone here at the bottom of the pelvis and come down to the back of the knee. One comes more to the outside of the knee. The other 2 come more to the inside of the knee. And we're going to see sort of the implications of some tightness in these areas in the next few slides. And I wanted to just show this picture of posture, because I think I can explain a little bit what happens when these muscles become a little bit tight. So here on the left, you can see this line down the middle, that this line is sort of, the plumb line that goes from the ear through the shoulders, down through the hip, through the knee, and through the ankle. So that's more of what we would say is the neutral alignment we want to achieve. You'll see here this little curve in through the spine. That is a natural curve that should be there. And that just tells us that those bones in the spine are stacked really nicely and have the least amount of load and stress placed on them. We also know that in this position, our hips are going to be in their best position, as our knees. If we look over on the right, you can see that this curve is a little bit reduced. And when this is reduced, the pelvis is a little bit tucked under. So here where the hamstrings are tight, when they're tight, they pull the pelvis under and can flatten that lumbar spine there, that little curve that should be there. And at the same time, when that's pulled under, we may also see a little bit of tightening here at the front of the hip flexors. And if you notice here with this change in posture, if you can look at what happens to my knees here. On the left-hand side, they're in a nice neutral position. But when I've changed my posture there, all of a sudden my knees are in a flexed position. And when they're in that flexed position all the time, that places some abnormal loads and stresses on the knee joint. And so this is what I mean about looking at our movement patterns and how things all work together, is that we want to make sure that we can lengthen out these muscles to sort of achieve the best possible alignment, not just in standing, but in our movement. So we'll listen to this video here.
So let's talk about a squat. It's a great exercise for anyone. I'm going to stand sideways so you can see what's happening with my spine, my hips, and my knees. When a lot of people squat, what I see happen anyways is that they try to keep their back nice and straight and tall and squat down. And if you look at what's happening here, my knees are shooting forward. Yes, my back is straight and tall, but I'm putting a lot of strain on my knees. And really, I haven't actually bent my hips very much. If I hinge my hips back and bend a little bit more at my hips, can you see how my knees then come back a little bit? So I'm not straining there as much. My back is still straight or in its neutral position, but I'm just sitting back where I'm getting into my hips a little bit more. And from this position, as I stand up, I'm going to be using my glutes and my hamstrings more, which is what we want, the intention of the exercise. So we don't want to be going straight up and down like this. You can see how my knees are going forward. That becomes really hard on the knees. We want to sit back as if we're sitting in a chair. And as we're sitting back, keeping our chest lifted as best we can, and really hinging at our hips. If we find that we're tight through hamstrings, muscles at the back of the legs, or our hip flexors here at the front, we might find that it's hard to get that real hip hinge, and as we go down, that we start to kind of round our back. And when our back is really rounded, can you see what happens to my knees? They push forward, which in this position, again, we're straining the knees, but now we're also straining our back because it's in a flexed position. So I want to tilt my pelvis back so that I've got this curve in my back and that hinge in the hips. If you find that it's really hard to achieve that form.
So you can see how when, hopefully you can see that with that squat, how important it is to have that mobility. Oh, goodness, I've lost my screen. I guess I didn't. I didn't have too much action on the screen, and it decided I was done. All right, here we are. We're back again. So you can see how when we look at how somebody squats, we can often see where those movement restrictions are. So that's often the first thing that I'll have people do is I'm going to look at some of these functional movements. And I can kind of see, well, what's happening at their hips? So, are they getting the mobility here? Do they tend to sort of tuck their pelvis under? I call it a little bit of a butt wink, that as you lower down, that pelvis then tilts under, which then loads the back, loads the knees. If you're not able to kind of bring your chest and lift upwards and you've got some stiffness through this thoracic spine, that impacts how well you're able to squat. We also need a certain amount of mobility at the ankles. You can see here that if that movement is limited, the body's going to figure out how to move some other way, and we end up putting more load on our knees. So that's often the first thing I look at is how is this person performing their squat? So it's something that you can have a look at in the mirror and see, how am I doing this? Am I able to really sink back in my hips, or do I tend to sort of tuck under? The other thing to pay attention to is, do your knees fall in? That's a little bit more about strength rather than mobility, and we will get to talking about that. But that's sort of the first thing that we would look at to kind of get a sense of what's the functional range of motion like. And so for thoracic spine mobility, if we kind of discover, you know what, that's one of the things that's really limiting my ability to squat, is then one of my favorite exercises is to do this simple exercise over a foam roller. And if you don't have a foam roller, you can roll a blanket or use a yoga mat or something like that. And when we're lying lengthwise over this roll, we get a really gentle extension of our thoracic spine that takes us out of our tendency to be rounded forward. There's a lot of other extension movements that we can do using that foam roller, but this is sort of the simplest, easiest one to do that most people can manage. But that's something that if we find, okay, there's some difficulty there, we want to look at what are some other options of how we can move that thoracic spine. Then we also want to look at, so when we're looking at hip mobility, hamstrings, which attach to, as we saw before, attach to the back of the leg that go from your sit bone down to the back of the knee. We want to look at what's your range of motion. And I find that, you know, if you can get to that 90 degrees, that's fantastic. You're a little bit less than that, it's probably still okay, because really when we're running, you know, we don't always have this huge lengthened stride. We do tend to, as we run a little faster, you know, our stride may lengthen out a little bit. And that's where that mobility may come into play, that we need to improve that mobility. If this mobility here, we sort of determine that, you know what, it's really hard to even get your leg remotely close to that, chances are those hamstrings are impacting how well you're moving through daily life, not just your running, but how we're sitting, standing, squatting, those kinds of things. So we want to sort of look, you can look at it from a supine position. And this is here on the right, looking at sort of checking out your mobility this way. And this is a common stretch that runners do to stretch the hamstrings. The one big mistake that I find that runners do is they put their leg up on a really high object, thinking, okay, the higher I go, the bigger stretch and I'm going to get. But if you put your leg up that high, if in order to do that, what happens is your tailbone again pulls under because that hamstring isn't long enough. We're not really truly lengthening out the hamstring. So we want to make sure we're keeping this neutral curve here. And you may find that in doing this, you're not getting very far at all. And that might be a little bit of a sign to you that, yeah, my hamstrings need a little bit of work. And again, this is when we sort of find, okay, is it impacting our ability to move in the way that we want to, that's effective and efficient and less stressful for our bodies?
I'm Miriam. I'm a physiotherapist.
So this is just going through some hip flexor stretching and some variations that does get us moving, not just our hip flexors, but our trunk. And I like things that kind of give us the most bang for buck.
Sitting through the day, and it certainly is a great stretch for runners. So I love doing it at the bottom of my stairs, but I'm going to show you here with a chair. It's another great option to do if you're sitting at your office and you just need to get up and move. So stand facing your chair, making sure your hips are squared forward. And step one foot up onto the chair. From here, just lunge forward, making sure that your knees are not going past your toes. Your heel can come up a little bit, and you might want to spread that leg a little further away to make sure that you're really feeling a stretch here. So from here, you can reach your arms up towards the ceiling, which is going to give you a little bit more of a stretch through the front.
It's also going to give you some mobility through your thoracic spine here at the same time. And you can see how with this side bend, we're getting some mobility through the thoracic spine, but also a little bit more through those hip flexors.
The other variation is to take your hand to the outside of this hand, or outside that knee, sorry, and turn your body towards the side.
And again, we're getting that nice combined movement of stretching the hip flexors, but also moving through the thoracic spine. So I like things that give us our bang for buck, you know? And then if we look at ankle mobility and strength, I've kind of combined these together here. And if we start here with this first one on the left, just doing heel raises off the edge of your stair. So yes, we're getting a little bit of strength as we're lifting up, but we also are getting a little bit of lengthening of the muscle. And I'll explain in a minute, you know, why this is probably just as valuable or more valuable than just doing a straight calf stretch. But this is sort of the first level. This kind of gets us leading a little bit into the strength piece, is starting with doing both legs at the same time. The next level would be doing one at a time, but having a little bit of help with this left foot here on there so that I'm doing more work with my right leg. It's just not fully off. So sometimes if you find that doing one leg at a time is too challenging, giving a little bit of help on that side is helpful. Okay. And this last one here is doing one leg at a time. And you'll notice for me, I switched legs here. At the time when I did this video, I was recovering from a fairly serious ankle sprain, and I would not have been able to do one leg at a time on my right side at the time. I can now, but at that time I couldn't. So this movement here, I think, is really important for runners. And let me first just talk a little bit about kind of the strengthening aspect of this. Eccentric training, an eccentric muscle contraction is when the muscle is contracting as it's lengthening. A concentric muscle contraction is a contraction when the muscle is shortening. So if we go back here, when you're rising up onto your toes, that muscle is shortening. That's the concentric muscle contraction part of the movement. As you slowly lower down and you're lengthening all the way down, the muscle is working to control that lengthening. And it's called an eccentric contraction to control that movement. And, it's interesting, there is some research. So initially the research from animal models suggested that eccentric training could increase flexibility via sarcomerogenesis, which is really sort of the kind of the building of the little muscle fibers that connect without additional need for stretching exercises. And there was this systematic review that did find that there was consistent evidence from 6 high-quality studies that supported this hypothesis. And so when we look at, what we were doing here, oh, it's not letting me go back, you're getting a little bit of a bonus here of we're doing some strength work, but you're also working on mobility of the ankle at the same time. So what does research say about strength training for runners? And, it's interesting, there is inconsistent results that suggest that strengthening actually decreases running risk or injury of risk in running. But the research does support that strength training decreases injury in sports in general, like basketball and soccer. So, it's an interesting finding. Why is there the difference? And, someone's commentary on this that I found interesting was that, in running, there's never a ceiling. Runners are always pushing towards the next goal, whether it's distance, time, speed, whatever it might be. Whereas when you're playing a soccer game or you're playing a basketball game, there is a finite end to that. So with runners, are we, where's that upper limit, right? We set a goal, and when we get there, we set another one, right? And, and I think there's probably some limitations in the studies that really allow us to look at that effectively. But what the research does suggest is that strength training can improve our performance, which is probably, up there with runners is importance. I don't know, as far as decreasing running injuries versus improving our performance, which one's more important? I'm not sure. And they did find, there was a systematic review that found that strength training does provide benefit to improving running economy, time trial performance, maximal sprint speed in middle and long distance runners of all abilities, not just the elite athletes. And that adding strength training in the form of heavy resistance training, explosive resistance training, plyometric training, which is like jumping, performed 2 or 3 occasions per week is likely to positively affect performance. One comment that I would say about all of these, though, is that if you haven't been doing any resistance training, I would not want to see you jump to doing explosive resistance training or plyometric training, because from a physiotherapist standpoint, I want to make sure that your tendons and muscles have the capacity to withstand the load that comes with plyometric training. So you really need to work on the strength piece first for a period of time before you move to that more explosive training. But once you've got that strength, adding in that explosive training, the research is showing that that can have a positive impact on your performance. So, you know, I think there's definitely a benefit to adding strength training into our running routine, our running training program. And I think from a physiotherapist perspective that, you know, we work to improve capacity, strength of tendons and muscles when people are injured, which helps them recover. That I think the same is true of runners who are potentially returning from injury, that this is a really important piece. And there is that chance that it's just not been demonstrated yet in the research that this strengthening can prevent injuries. So what are the best exercises that we want to do? So a study back in 2009 looked at a variety of different exercises for different muscles in around the hip. So the gluteus medius muscle, which is one of those muscles kind of around the buttocks, the side of the hip, that is really important in stabilizing our pelvis when we're running. So some of their top exercises, the top tier exercises, were hip abduction, like a side lying leg lift, a single limb squat, band walking, where you've got the TheraBand around and you're sidestepping, single limb deadlift, sideways hop. For gluteus maximus, the top tier exercises were a single limb squat, a single limb deadlift, a unilateral wall squat. Are you kind of getting the picture of what's important to work towards? So based on this study and other studies, that exercises that require single limb balance and hip flexion extension through a large range of motion and cause changes to the body's center of mass relative to its base of support appear to result in the greatest level of gluteus maximus activation. And again, when you think about what happens with running, every step is a single leg activity that requires us to absorb and control the forces through one leg at a time. It is a single leg sport. It is a single leg activity. And when you start then adding in running on trails, right, we need some balance. We need to be able to recover ourselves when we kind of hit a stone or a root or something like that, or the camber in the road. So the single leg activity is what's most important. The problem is that a lot of times people don't necessarily have the strength to do it well, and might end up creating some injury. So when we look at, I'm going to come to looking at how this was, we're going on to the next study, which is a more recent one in 2023 that looked at sort of exercises with the highest peak gluteus maximus muscle force. So very similar results: the loaded split squat, loaded single leg Romanian deadlift, a loaded single leg thrust, the gluteus medius, the body weight side plank, a loaded single leg squat, a loaded single leg Romanian deadlift. So again, very similar results, and you're kind of getting the idea of the kinds of things that we really need to do. And those with gluteus minimus is another gluteal muscle that helps with that control of the pelvis, is a body weight side plank, a single leg Romanian deadlift. So when we look at hip strength, what I tend to look at, and you'll see in this video that I've come into a bridge, and when I lift the leg, and this is a functional assessment that I'll have people do in the clinic, is that when you lift one leg up, you want to make sure that you can keep your pelvis level. And if when you lift one leg, your pelvis drops, either once at a time, or you just can't keep it lifted and it drops down, that's telling me that those gluteal muscles are not strong enough to keep that pelvis level. And if it's not keeping the pelvis level here on the ground, it's probably not necessarily doing an effective job every time we land as we run. So that is one important thing that I will look at when I'm going through an assessment of somebody, and certainly something that you can look at yourself and kind of check out. And if you're finding, yeah, I can't do that, then you kind of, okay, I need to do some of these exercises, and we'll kind of talk about ones too that you can include. So then I also want to look at a squat. So you're going to see in the video to the right here is I'm doing a ball squat. And one of the reasons I like doing a ball squat, and you'll see on the picture here on the left that, you know, his buttocks is really coming back underneath the ball. So it really encourages that hip hinge. gets us out of our tendency to have our knees coming too far forward. When we have the ball there, we can really sort of lean back and make sure that we're keeping ourselves upright. When we're doing these squats, what I'm also looking at is what's happening at the knees. Are they falling inwards? And you can see right now where I've gotten to here where we're doing kind of a semi-single squat. I've got a little bit of weight through my back toe, but I will definitely have somebody do a single squat. So I'll have them look at a squat, look at the mobility through the thoracic spine, the hips, the ankles. How well are they doing that movement, right? What areas need some mobility work? I'm also going to look at, are they starting to collapse inwards at all? And if they are, that's telling me, we definitely need to work on some strength. By the same token, if we do a single leg squat and I have them do that, and they either can't do a very deep squat, like they can't do that same range as when they're doing a double leg squat, or you'll see them when they're squatting that they're wobbling all over and their knee collapses in. That's telling me that those muscles, your glute max, your gluteus medius, all of those muscles there are not doing their job to stabilize at the pelvis. And over time, when we start loading our run, when we start building that training, and we have a greater chance of going beyond our capacity when we start doing our runs either too long or too fast, that our muscles aren't necessarily strong enough to keep up with the capacity or the demands of our run. So this is where strengthening, I believe, is really important to improve the strength around the hips to allow us to have better capacity to absorb those loads. Oh, sorry, we don't need to watch that again. So here's, this video here goes through a group of side lying exercises that I will often give people when I see that there is some weakness, particularly when there's some weakness, just even with a bridge, right? And so that side lying leg lift, right? That was one of those ones that really kind of gets at the gluteus medius muscle. When we add a little bit of those leg circles, we're adding some more demand with movement. When we add this bottom leg lift, we're having some work to keep our leg up there, but lifting that leg, we're getting a little bit of the adductors, but we actually do start to use, our quadratus lumborum, which is kind of a muscle at the side of our body, using a little bit of the core. And when you do all of these in a row, it actually becomes very challenging. This I'm going into a bit of a modification of a side plank. And this is often where I'll start people is with their knees bent. It's a little bit easier than when your legs are out long. That's getting easier. You can add raising that top leg. And whether you decide, I'm going to do some leg lifts there, some leg circles there, you can do that. And it just makes it more challenging. And where the work is on the bottom hip here. So lifting your leg up here, then lifting the top leg up. And that really gets at that side plank exercise that we saw numerous times in best exercises for gluteus medius. And these exercises, these are Pilates based. They're not hard to do. They don't take a long time to do. You don't have to do them every day. Like we're talking 2 or 3 times a week, right? To kind of go through that, you might go through them just once. You might go through them twice, depending on your time and the challenge to them. This video is looking at some different variations for a bridge. So certainly just doing, if you find, again, yes, you have a hard time with that bridge and keeping one foot off the other, is working on a bridge. You'll see here that I've moved my feet out. And the difference here is when my feet are a little further away, I'm going to be working my hamstrings a little bit more. And if you try that out yourself with your feet closer and doing that bridge, you're going to feel more work in your buttocks. When your feet go a little further away, you're going to feel more work in your hamstrings. And then moving a single bridge, if that's really easy, do one leg at a time. That is really going to then target those glutes and hamstrings. So side lying exercises, they're getting a little too easy. Let's add some challenge to it. You always want to make sure that you're challenging the muscles. If you can do 12, 15 repetitions plus, and it's not hard, you could just feel like you could keep going, it's not enough challenge. You're not going to make a big enough difference. We need challenge. And so sometimes that challenge is giving us more resistance. Maybe it's changing the surface on which we're doing the exercise, like the ball. Just having that instability there challenges our ability to complete the exercise. An easy way to make some changes to make it a little bit more challenging. We can also use the ball to make our bridging a little bit more challenging. We can certainly, when we're doing a bridge, we can use a weight or something like that on top of our pelvis to give us some more resistance. But you'll find that, you know, the ball is another great way to add some challenge. And so again, doing it with your feet in closer, you're going to be using your glutes a little bit more. Here with your leg out long, you're going to get at your hamstrings a little bit more. And it's a really great way to target both glutes and hamstrings. This last version here actually gets into some eccentric work of the hamstring. So you'll see as the ball's being curled in, that hamstring is shortening. That's a concentric contraction. Whereas when it's lengthening out, and it's the hamstrings are lengthening, but it is still working. That is more of an eccentric contraction. And for somebody who has tight hamstrings, that may be something that actually helps to improve the length of your hamstrings. This is one of my favorite exercises for runners, is the split squat. One of the things that I love about this, and as you saw, this was one of the best exercises for your glute max, your glute med, your glute min, is that you're really targeting that standing leg, the outer hip. But the other thing that's happening here is we're getting a really nice opening in through the front of the hip there. So we're getting that hip flexor stretch as well as strengthening on the other side. That's a lot of bang for buck. And I love getting big bang for buck. I don't want to do a million exercises. I want to do a few key ones that when I do well and make them challenging, is going to give me big returns. Because let's face it, if you've got a chance to go for a run, you're going to take the time to go for a run, not do a strength exercise. And if that strengthening program takes too long, chances are you're not doing it, right? So the other way you can build in some strength is just with with stairs, right? So on the left here, you'll see that I'm just doing a bit of a step up, okay? So one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're doing this is that you want the work to really come from that front leg, that you're not pushing off your toes, okay? So some simple ways of just getting a little more strength work into your day is when you're going up your stairs, go up 2 steps at a time and make sure you're not really pushing off with that bottom leg, but use that leg that you're stepping up with, using that to do the work, okay? And certainly this one here, the step down, this is one that might not have made the top tier of exercises, but is still an effective exercise. Again, you want to make sure that you're really getting that hip hinge so that you're not necessarily coming too far forward. Because if we're not getting movement at the hip, we're not really using our glutes and hamstrings, which is kind of the intention of all of these exercises, right? So one of the things that I like about yoga is some of the standing poses are really great for runners. And so this is a really short yoga flow that I like to do, that I will often include in my own personal practice, but will often give to runners here. And you can see how, you're spending a long time on that one leg, okay? It's you're coming back into that lunge here. I'm just going to have it go through again so we can kind of watch the different exercises. So here's your squat. You can decide, you know what, maybe I'm going to stay here for 5 breaths. You can either hold each pose for a period of time or you go through them and repeat it. So there's your squat. There's your lunge. And as you move forward into what we call warrior 3, there's your single leg deadlift. Let yourself come all the way up, some dynamic movement that you have to control. And then you're going back to that single leg deadlift, back to that lunge. And you've done a lot of those exercises that have been shown to be really great exercises for our glute max, our glute med, glute minimus. And that little routine actually doesn't take very long to do. Now, to have some benefit to it, you need to make it challenging enough. But depending on where you're at with your strength, you may find that by simply doing that, and say each pose, each part of that you hold, say for 5 slow breaths, which is probably 30 seconds or more for each one, that's a long time to be standing on one leg. Your hip, you're on that standing leg, you're going to be feeling it. It's going to be burning. So it's something that when you're tight for time, you know, you can still get some benefit of strengthening those muscles, but it doesn't have to be this massively long workout. So I think what's really important to establish is knowing what you need to work on. And, you know, when we're doing, when I'm doing an assessment, I am going to talk a lot to you about what are you doing for running? What are you doing for other exercise? How long have you been running? How fast, how far? What's your activity outside of it? What do you do for work? What are your sleep habits? Any other life stressors? All of these things that potentially can contribute to that overall picture of injury risk. Then we are definitely going to look at range of motion, strength, functional movements to give me an idea of how well you're moving and what are some areas that we can really improve upon to allow you to be more effective with your strengthening, but also to allow you to get the most out of your running and your gait, your form. So we're going to look at, what happens when you run? You know, do you extend, you know, do you overstride? Some people, they make the mistake of overstriding, right? And that can be really hard on the hamstrings. So, you know, we really want to look at what is it that you do? You know, for some women, if you're having some difficulty with incontinence, having a pelvic floor assessment can give us a sense of what's the health of those tissues and their capacity to absorb that load. Because everybody's program does need to be personalizing according to your needs. Somebody who's got really flexible hamstrings doesn't need to stretch their hamstrings. You might want to keep moving them and you can stretch them if it feels good, but we don't necessarily need to gain that movement or mobility. Hip flexors, common area where I do think most people are a little bit tight because we do spend a lot of time sitting, a lot of time bending forward. And if that's something that you do, this is where, you know, as part of your warm up before your run is don't just kind of jump right into your run. This is where the dynamic warm up with maybe some walking lunges or, you know, just some leg swings. You might kind of do a bit of where you kind of put your foot up on a stair or chair and not necessarily do a prolonged stretch, but do that lunge movement where you're lunging in and out. So you're just moving the joint, not a prolonged stretch, but just moving the joint, getting some mobility. Same thing with the thoracic spine. If you've been sitting all day, a little bit of some thoracic spine mobility, maybe you're leaning back over the chair or, you know, just doing a little bit of some twisting. That's what's the one thing that the karaoke movement is like. It's a side bending. So we get a little bit of movement through the thoracic spine. Think about what you're coming from before you start your run and what kind of movements that you need. And it really does need to be according to you and what your body needs. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your stretch programming, your warm-up is going to look exactly like your running partner. And strength, we've sort of talked about all of the, you know, squats, single squats, I would say has got to be your, you know, building up to the ability to do that. Don't just work on single squats and muscle through something if you're not doing it well. That is not going to be advantageous. And chances are you're going to show up with some knee pain because you're straining the knee excessively. You need to sort of identify, okay, no, I can't really do a single squat very well. I need to build the strength. What are the things that I need to do to build up to that? And that is going to be things like your side planks, you know, some of those side leg lifts, the bridges, those kinds of things to build the strength. Calf strengthening, I do think is really important. Every stride you take, you are pushing off with your toes. You're using those calf muscles. The faster you go, there's more explosive power that's needed. We need some strength there every single step. So it is something that, you know, if you're only doing a couple things, some kind of squat variation, some kind of calf strengthening. Those are key. And I would hazard to say something like a side plank or I know side planks are really difficult for some people with shoulder issues. There's other ways to target those muscles. And that's, again, how it needs to be personalized according to your body. Core, I've kind of put in there. That is another whole conversation. When I say core, I don't just mean abdominal strengthening. You're actually working your core when you're doing all of these different kind of exercises. And this is where I think things like planks, where we add some leg movements and so on, is probably the most beneficial thing. And that, I think, is another whole conversation that would have taken us way over time limit if we kind of got into that conversation about core. So if you do have questions about that, certainly reach out to me and we can talk about what is it that is important for runners about core. But just know that when you're doing things like your squats and your lunges and all of those kinds of things, you are automatically engaging your core as you do that. And, I include in here yoga for runners, and yoga is not for everybody, but I do think there is something of value for runners, and it isn't just about stretching. That's not what it's about. I think what's important for runners is the standing poses, there's a lot of great strength that happens from those standing poses, as well as there's a lot of balance work. And so your proprioception when you're, looking to be running on the trails, flexibility, mobility, more of moving your body through these ranges of motion. But the other piece about it is that rest and recovery, that calming of the nervous system, that focus on the breath and the mindfulness, the meditation aspect of that really calms the nervous system. And when we know that we live very stressful lives, yes, running is one thing that we do to help manage our stress. But physical stress and emotional stress, it's all the same to our body. And if we're always loaded, we need to allow our stress cup to empty a little bit. And so that's where that rest and recovery is important, that it's not all about pushing really hard. We need to allow that time for recovery. And so whether it might not be yoga, it might just simply be some gentle stretching with some nice music, that breathing, that kind of thing. But I just wanted to sort of throw that in there, that I think there's a lot of benefit of yoga for runners. And it's not just about doing those high energy flow classes. It is also the yin classes that work on the stretch and the calm and so on, of just functional mobility. Okay. And I mentioned this in the last webinar that I did. Training is like an apple crisp recipe. There are so many different apple crisp recipes out there. Have you been on Pinterest and looked at how many? And they all are basically the same, but there's varying amounts of flour or types of flour. Maybe it's almond flour or oat flour or whatever kind of flour, and varying amounts of oats. There's always sugar, there's always butter, and of course there's always apples. And those variations are individual, because each body has individual needs as far as strength and mobility and our capacity to manage load and how our training should progress. It really can't be the same as our running partner, because we've got different bodies, different needs. And so that's where it's really important to find out what works best for you and work with somebody who can help you determine that. And that's where I think working with health professionals that understand running and understand the body and can help sort of figure out, okay, what's the best training plan for you? What's the best strength mobility plan for you, and get you set on the right track. Because running is something that we want to do for our lifetime, not just to achieve and excel at the next race. We want to be able to keep running. And if we approach it patiently and intelligently, we're consistent, we're going to enjoy the benefits of this for a very long time. So if you have any questions about anything that we've talked about today, please feel free to reach out to me. I can be reached. The top two, that's our website here. The top email is just to our front desk and to the clinic. You can reach us on Instagram and Facebook, and this email at the bottom will come directly to me. So I've talked a lot, and I'm just wondering if are there any questions? And if there are, just pop them in the chat. If you don't have any questions now, and you think of some later, please do reach out to me, and I'll do my best to answer your question. If you want some help with establishing what your training plan should be, from the amount and type of running that you should be doing to what are the best strength and mobility exercises for you and your body, then please reach out and we can set something up. We can certainly just chat first with a free 15-minute consultation before we jump right into an assessment if you're not sure about what you need. Okay, so if there are not any further questions, it doesn't look like there are, I'm going to say good night and thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully tomorrow brings some nicer weather and you can get out and enjoy a run. Okay, see you again soon.